Hello everybody! Today we're talking about Revolutionary Catalonia, also sometimes called the CNT FIA or the Anarchist Catalonia. It was this region in Spain which was controlled by people following anarchist principles during the Spanish Civil War. In this video I will explain the historical and political context that led to Free Catalonia being established, as well as some parts of the Civil War that are relevant. But I will not be talking about the Civil War battle for battle. This video is about Catalonia, its politics and what living it was like, not about explaining the Civil War battle for battle. Because I think it's far more interesting to look at how they tried to build a new society. If you want to see more about this topic, I recommend you watch my content creator stream tomorrow at 4 PM Austrian time. And if you want to know way less, I now have a channel called Wiki1999 Shorts, where I sum up my videos in 60 seconds or less. I also have a TikTok where I upload the exact same clips. That being said, let's get started. Our story begins where else than World War I. Spain did not take part in the World War, but just like the rest of Europe, they had massive amounts of angry leftists. These leftists could sort of be split in two camps. The state-oriented socialists, who you can imagine a bit like Leninists, though of course they were far more diverse than a Bolshevik party, and the anarchist leftists. They were syndicalists. Just as a short recap, syndicalists want to abolish the state, and instead they want workers' unions to run everything using direct democracy or delegates, depending on the syndicalist you talk to. To anarchists, the autonomy of political minority regions like Catalonia is critical. On the far right of the political spectrum, there were nationalists and later fascists that wanted pretty much the opposite. They wanted a strong state to keep foreigners out and to repress political minorities like the Catalonians, using a strong central government and leadership based in Madrid. Unfortunately, Spain was literally a monarchy at the time, so these groups that wanted to take over or destroy the government had a hard time actually taking power. But in 1931, the king was deposed, and there were to be democratic elections. That didn't work out for very long. Both the right and the left were fractured to so many parties that they had trouble actually ruling anything. If you watched my video on the internationals, the following may sound familiar. The USSR proclaimed that from now on, leftist parties should create united fronts with everyone who was anti-fascist to more effectively resist the rising tide of fascism all across Europe. So, in 1936, the leftist parties formed the so-called Popular Front to make sure that the fascists and conservatives would not win the election in the same year. This Popular Front was of course made up of different communist and Marxist parties, libertarian leftists and even actual liberal capitalists who opposed fascism. Seeing this, all fascist and nationalist forces in Spain likewise formed their own united front for this election. They were known as the nationalist faction. They had monarchists and nationalists and fascists and national syndicalists, totalitarians and a group called Francoists, who were led by a guy called Fransico Franco, who was a nationalist general and who will come up more than once. So, who will win? How will the democratic election end up? The leftist Popular Front or the rightist nationalist faction? It was the leftist Popular Front. Because of the imminent threat of nationalist military leaders overthrowing the new socialist government, they immediately went about removing these generals from their posts. This did not make them happy. So, because they lost the election, the nationalist faction started a coup against the democratically elected government. The president did not react swiftly enough. The syndicalists offered their help against the nationalist uprising that started all over Spain, but he refused to give them guns and then stepped down. He was replaced by another guy whose government was never officially confirmed, so according to the nationalists, his government was illegitimate. The goals of the nationalist leaders were all over the place. Some wanted Mussolini-style fascism, some wanted the monarchy to return, and others yet wanted to establish a military junta with themselves in charge. Others yet were pure anti-communists and cared about nothing besides killing syndicalists. Eventually, Franco would take over the nationalist faction and determine how it's run, which coincidentally was with Franco in complete control at its head. Naturally, the socialist government was not okay with being overthrown, so they immediately mobilized the militia and the few army units that remained loyal to the government. This is where we look at the CNT FAI and Catalonia again. Just as a side note, CNT translates to the National Confederation of Labour, which was the one big union of the region, and FIA refers to the Anarchist Federation of Iberia. They are completely different organizations, but especially during the Civil War, they work together very tightly, so they're often called CNT FAI, and from this point I will occasionally refer to them both as syndicalists. Unfortunately, even after the nationalists started a successful armed uprising, the central government of Spain still wasn't willing to arm the syndicalists, because they considered them untrustworthy. After all, they're anarchists, so it sort of makes sense that a centralized state would not trust them. So the anarchists made the very hard decision to join the government. First the regional government in Catalonia and later the central government that was still ruled by the United Front, mainly Marxists. This gave them access to weapons, which they needed to fight the nationalists, and it also caused a major split among the anarchists in the world. Russian syndicalist Alexander Shapiro harshly criticized the syndicalists joining the government, and Emma Goldman supported it. Her logic was that allying with Marxists would be less bad than letting fascism win the Civil War. This, of course, sparked many debates inside of Catalonia itself as well. Now, as a socialist, what would you expect to happen to a country when there's a fascist coup? Exactly, a counter-revolution. And just a few months after the start of the Civil War, the leftists started the Spanish Revolution of 1936. Pretty much all factories, stores, railroads, farms, and much more were taken over by their workers, effectively making landowners a thing of the past. This civil war had broadly two factions. Nationalist Spain, made up of all types of rightists, and Republican Spain, with the leftist government. A faction within Republican Spain was the CNT FAI, which controlled Catalonia. So, fascists, communists, anarchists. At the onset of the Spanish Civil War, the major European nations, namely France, Britain, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the USSR, signed a non-intervention treaty to stop this civil war from turning into a world war. It did not work very well. Quickly, the leftist parties of the continent formed an international brigade of volunteers to defend Republican Spain. And yes, George Orwell was one of these international volunteers. He was shot in the throat while fighting the nationalists. Pretty much at the same time as the international brigade formed, Hitler and Mussolini sent many aircraft, tanks, and troops to Spain to support the Francoists, completely and overtly ignoring the non-intervention treaty they signed. See, this is why you can't trust fascists. In response, the USSR supported the socialist Republican government. Support came in the form of aircraft, tanks, artillery, rifles, and military advisors. No direct military support though, only equipment, and even that was to be kept completely secret. I will now talk about what life was like in Catalonia and what kind of changes the syndicalists made to the region they ruled. Because of this, I will ignore the following 2 years of the Civil War. Just know that Catalonia formed many militias and was supported by many international brigades, which effectively defended the region. We will return to the Civil War once we get to the section on the collapse of Revolutionary Catalonia. So, technically, during the entire syndicalist period, the one in charge was this guy, appointed as governor of Catalonia by the Republican government. But in praxis, nobody was listening to him, and his job was sort of pointless because people instead listened to the CNT FAI. So let's see how these syndicalists tried to implement anarchist ideas in the real world. Naturally, as anarchists, they wanted to have the leadership be bottom up, not top down. Essentially, all local choices and decisions were made by assemblies. Anyone could attend the assemblies and vote, though if you didn't show up, you wouldn't get a vote. The idea was the exact same as with the communes in Magnovia. Representatives inherently have different interests than the people, so it's better to empower the people themselves to make choices instead of trusting politicians. Naturally, this only worked on a local level, and these assemblies quickly held congresses talking about forming a federation. This was never implemented, but in praxis, the CNT, which remember was the one big union, organized these regions when it came to trade and defense. Catalonia was one of the most industrialized regions of all of Spain, which is also why they had so many socialists and syndicalists. More workers mean more unions. And naturally, these unions immediately formed industrial collectives and took over factories and the like. They also abolished private property and expropriated a lot of industrialists and landowners. To run these businesses, the workers would elect 15 people to manage them, all elected by the workers affected by their decisions, though the union was guaranteed some of the seats. This way, the leadership of the business was able to take quick actions instead of declaring a meeting of 500 employees every time they need to make a choice. But they were still accountable to all of the workers, striking a balance between speed and workers' control. Naturally, you can argue about whether this was a good thing. Interestingly, the productivity of all the factories went up when they were under worker control, and predictably the profits made by these businesses were mostly proportionally distributed among all workers. But they also gave some to healthcare, education and unemployment. Remember, without a central state to raise taxes, these things basically depend on the generosity of workers' collectives or councils. Of course, the Republican government also meddled with the economy in Catalonia, and they insisted that the state take over some industry in a Leninist-style state socialist economy, which naturally was controversial with the syndicalists. Their system of distribution is hard to pin down. Some factories took part in the bartering, others issued their own money, and some used money from the Republican government. Depending on which leftist you ask, money is sometimes seen as inherently exploitative, which is too complicated to explain in this video, so you should definitely subscribe to Wiki 2000 because I will go into more detail on that in my stream tomorrow. Because many didn't like money, they instead relied on labor vouchers. One voucher was worth 1 hour of labor, no matter if you work in a field or a factory. This effectively made all labor equal, and anarchists and leftists in general love equal pay for equal work. That has sort of been the core goal of leftists ever since Karl Marx got this all started. In general, most collectivized workplaces formed joint councils with other businesses and local regions to discuss demand and production and be able to plan the economy without a central leadership, which was mostly successful. Naturally, not only industrial workers were disadvantaged by capitalism, farmers were too. So, during the Spanish Revolution of 1936, where the industrial workers took over the industry, the farmers also collectivized farmland. This mostly consisted of seizing the land of landowners and having it be owned by collectives. This also applied to livestock and such. Just like the industrial collectives, these farms took part in many local organizations to facilitate economic exchange. Many of these collectives joined in with the local unions for defense and organization. Interestingly enough, a farmer could take some of the collective land and just leave the collectives, which was tolerated as long as they didn't hire anyone, because that would be exploitation. To me, this sounds like allowing private property, which according to the CNT FAI itself was not compatible with anarchism. But they were still in a civil war, so maybe they just didn't want to start fighting peasants and nationalists. Now, there are accusations that the anarchists in Catalonia used forced labor camps, and I will spend a minute looking at that. It turns out, indeed, the Republican government did intend to set up, or actually set up, concentration camps for prisoners of war and enemies of the Republic. Note that I said the Republican government, not the syndicalists in Catalonia itself. The only evidence that Catalonia was involved in labor camps is that they were originally suggested by the Minister of Justice of the Republican government, who was a syndicalist himself, or at least he was one when he took office. So basically the Republican government did use forced labor, supported by at least one anarchist, but the syndicalist unions and the revolutionary territory in Catalonia never themselves ran labor camps, since that sort of goes against what anarchism is. But they did not oppose labor camps either when their allies used them. So, Catalonia is not exactly black and white. It is thoroughly grey, like all real-life politics. Now, the dissolution of Catalonia is not easy to explain, but I will try. There were two major political factions in the region, syndicalist CNT FAI and the United Socialist Party of Catalonia, which was basically working for the Republican government and with the USSR, so I will call them communists. Essentially, the syndicalists decided to ban the communists from the local government for going against anarchist principles. So, in response, the communists who had just taken over the Republican government banned all syndicalist meetings, but they could not enforce it because the police in the region was loyal to the syndicalists. So the government set up its own police force to take over. And then they dissolved the syndicalist military councils and basically turned the anarchist militias into a regular part of the Republican army. And then the Republican leadership began taking syndicalist military posts and industry, so the syndicalists mobilized all militias. After a bit of fighting, the two sides agreed on armistice. During this, pretty much every single communist party inside and outside of Spain declared the anarchists to be fascists and traitors to the revolution and Trotskyists and counter-revolutionary. Basically any insult a leftist would use for another leftist. The reasons for this are varying. The official reason was the fact that the anarchists shot back when the government troops began seizing CNT FAI land. But remember, the government was a communist party with very strong ties to other communist parties on the continent. So, when push came to shove, most parties and leftists around the world sided with the Republican government, not the anarchists. And of course, conflict was inevitable because state socialists and anarchists can't really coexist in the same territory, and both sides knew it. After the propaganda campaign, the communist government went about completely destroying the syndicalist power base. They stopped and blockaded arms shipments like planes, artillery, tanks. They banned and dissolved councils. They seized collectivized factories for the state. And they actually abolished agrarian communes and gave the land back to the landowners who it was taken from at the start of the revolution. Then the CNT and the FAI had a fight and stopped talking to each other. And this is where the civil war comes back into the picture. Because Franco and his nationalists had been doing things. You see, at the start of the civil war, Republican Spain controlled these two disconnected regions. By 1939, the Francoists had taken the land here to cut off Catalonia from the government in Madrid. So, despite not being a fan of the syndicalists and their militias, the communist government tried to launch an offensive to unify their territory again. It was a giant failure, and 30,000 of their soldiers died. And then the Francoists invaded Catalonia. And because they had no tanks, no planes and no artillery, they had little chance to defend themselves. Eventually, the nationalists took over the region. They abolished local autonomy, they banned the Catalan language and Catalan names, even a traditional Catalan dance. It was an attempt to completely destroy the Catalan culture and make them Spanish. Basically a cultural genocide lasting for decades and to some extent until today, with the 2017 Catalonian independence referendum being declared invalid by the Spanish government, despite getting a 92% vote for Catalan independence. I once read a tweet from somebody in Catalonia, which read, "You Americans and Europeans make TV shows about what if Hitler had won. Well, in Catalonia, that is reality." So, in conclusion, Revolutionary Catalonia was a very interesting attempt to create a socialist society. They made many more social and economic advances than comparable groups like Magnovia and the Paris Commune, and they were not afraid to implement things that were purely theoretical before them, like labor vouchers. Because they were in an active civil war, they of course had to betray their theoretical values by taking part in a local and central government. I would argue that uniting with the communists and Marxists was the right choice to make, considering their conditions, but of course you can disagree with that. Eventually the anarchist region was disarmed and weakened and demonized by their fellow leftists, making them unable to defend themselves against the fascist Francoists, which led to this attempt at anarchism being destroyed, and it ushered in a period of oppression for the Catalan people after Franco's forces completely destroyed the Republican Spanish government. So yeah, that is the video. Thank you for watching, and why not like and subscribe? If you like this hat and you want to know more about it, you should subscribe to Wiki 2000, where I usually make live streams every Saturday and Sunday at 4 PM Austrian time. Possibly not for next few weeks though, because I'm going to a psych ward for 1 to 6 weeks. And thank you for watching, and special thanks to Leia Harley, who for some reason paid me a Prager U tier. And of course my other Patreons: Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, V, Xander Corvus, Alexander Parch, Attila Nemetz, Carissa, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Coroselli, DSM-5 is better than ICD-10, Emily Marigold Klassen, Hannah Rickett, Herdina, Josh C, Klastrup, Liam S, Lilith Craft, Mamuka Tiliari, Marxism Tonight, Nana Epema, Pote, Raymond DeVille, Red Shock Trooper, Sean Murphy, Skylar Magnum Turner, Stairmaster Chef, Taylor CH, Trey, and Worshipper of the Olympians.